Register. I'm the Associate Director for the U of M Semester in Detroit program, and I think everybody can hear okay. Can you hear me back there okay? I just want to give a little introduction to the event tonight and thank everyone in particular. Adele mentioned opening day, which I'm sure we're all really looking forward to as we blow into our hands and try to warm up. It's an incredibly cold day. There's a lot of great activity that happens here at the Detroit Center, which has been here for 8 years, so we welcome you all to come back, as Adele said. And one of the programs that's situated here is the Semester in Detroit program. And I'll just briefly tell you what it is. This is a part of our curriculum, so we actually have 15 students right now in the program, and I think most of them have showed up. I know there's a few that are late. I've written down their names. But this is part of our curriculum, and these students come here for the semester. They live in Detroit. They're U of M Ann Arbor students as well as U of M Flint students. And we had U of M Dearborn students in the past. They live on Wayne State's campus. They take urban studies courses here. They're all undergraduates. And then they intern with different nonprofit organizations located around the city. And so if you'd like to learn more about Semester in Detroit, even if you're not an undergrad any longer, but you may be connected to an organization that might be interested in working with us, look up semesterindetroit.com and learn more information about it. And as I said, this is part of our curriculum. So in addition to having classes, we like to have hot topic discussions here, public forums, and we're really grateful to have our wonderful speakers who I'll be introducing in just a minute for this discussion. And this, in fact, is the second of a two-part focus on Detroit's Future City framework. As you can see, continuing the conversation. And if you weren't at the first event 3 weeks ago, we had a really nice packed house, and we also recorded it. And thank you to Mike Moreland back there who's recording this evening's as well, who works at the Detroit Center. If you want to check out the first event's presentation, which was on January 31st, we have it on YouTube. You can link to it off the Detroit Center's website. Dan Patera spoke that evening of the long-term Detroit Works project planning process, and we had remarks from Khalil Lagan from the Lower East Side Action program. We had remarks from Kwame Mensah from the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and also Dr. Jimmy Thomas from the U of M College Work Planning. So if you want to get a really good glimpse of the first discussion, which was really sort of an overview of what is this thing, the framework, and some initial impressions and perspectives about it. And you probably know that this thing, the framework over here, is not a small document, right? This is a massive amount of work that has been done on the Future City framework. And what we aim to do tonight, and what we invited our speakers to do tonight, is to talk with us about what are we supposed to do with this. And this is a big piece of work. It obviously has its own history, some of which we'll probably discuss tonight a little bit. But it's 374 plus pages, and there's a whole lot in it. And how do we actually relate to it from our various community perspectives in Detroit? How do we use this? How do we implement what's going on in it? How do we not use this document? And these are all questions that we pose for our speakers, and we want them to give us a sense of this from their vantage points in the city. And I'd like to introduce our three speakers, and I should mention you probably noticed that we had 4 speakers up there. In front of you, Angela Reyes, unfortunately, is quite ill with the flu, and so she's unable to make it tonight. She sends her regrets. Angela Reyes is the Executive Director of the Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, and so we're sorry that she's not here. But we do want to introduce our wonderful speakers who were able to make it tonight, and I'm going to do that right now. We're going to begin with some remarks by Mark Covington. And Mark was born and raised in Detroit. He's a lifelong resident of Georgia Street, and he started the Georgia Street Community Garden in 2008 after wanting to clean up vacant lots on his block. During that process, he saw a need to reintroduce his neighbors to better life skills and choices. That same year, he founded Georgia Street Community Collective, a nonprofit community organization that we'll hear more about this evening. And the GSCC is a community center with a library and community lab and hosts a number of annual community events. And I know that Mark was also involved, I think, in one of the committees, if I'm correct, and connected to the Detroit Works project at one point. We'll hear more about that. So we thank Mark for being here. I'll introduce the second speaker, who will be Shay Howell. She has been a Detroit activist for more than 3 decades. She works with youth, artists, and community-based development. She lectures on issues of social difference and peace, and writes a weekly column for the Michigan Citizen, which hopefully you've read recently. It's a very good column. Her most recent work is on political ideology and community transformation. She is a co-founder of Detroit Summer and of the Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership. She is a professor of communication at local university, where she has taught for 30 years. Over the last decade, she has been working with the Michigan Roundtable on school and community-based initiatives for community reconciliation. This work is informed by her activities with the Beloved Communities Initiative, which is formed to encourage spirit-rooted activism. We're grateful to have Jay Howell and Mark. And finally, we'll have remarks from Tom Gutierrez. And I apologize, Tom, I know your name is not spelled up there correctly, and I apologize for that. Since 1991, Tom has been the executive director of the Grandmont Rosedale Development Corporation up in the northwestern part of the city. It's a nonprofit community development organization, as I said, in northwest Detroit. He was born and raised on Detroit's east side, and his family and he have resided in the Grandmont Rosedale community for 22 years. He's a licensed architect and a graduate of the U of M School of Architecture. And he also served on the Mayor's Advisory Task to the Detroit Works Project, Task Force to the Detroit Works Project. So we're grateful to have Tom here. And basically how the format's going to work, we're going to have remarks from Mark, Shay, and then Tom. And then we're going to open it up and hopefully have a lot of dialogue and Q&A, because we're also very interested in your perspectives, both on the framework and also how you see using it in your own parts of Detroit and around the region. So thank you all very much for being here, and we'll turn things over to Mark Covington.
Thank you. Again, my name is Mark Covington. I'm founder and chairman of Georgia Street Community College. I have to be honest. I haven't read the whole. Nobody has. But the part pertaining to my neighborhood is what specifically I looked up, and I can't say I'm for it, and I can't say I'm against it, because there's three parts that's outlined for our neighborhood, and two of them just keep coming to mind: is the repurpose and decommission. Of course, I don't want to be decommissioned. But the repurpose, I believe, because of what we've started with the gardens in our neighborhood, that maybe we'll fit in pretty good with urban agriculture or urban farming in our neighborhood. We don't have a lot of participation from the neighbors, but I think for us not to be decommissioned, I think a lot of them would be willing to fall under that type of repurposing. Again, not for it or against it. It's pretty thick. Going back to decommissioning, we don't have a lot of nonprofit organizations in our neighborhood, but we do have a lot of churches that are not necessarily involved in community work, which is one of the reasons why I started the nonprofit. And a lot of the work that we do, we again started as a community garden, and then formed a nonprofit because of a lot of the donations that we were getting. I had no idea that I was going to get into it like I did, like food justice and helping the kids in our neighborhood. So, but our affiliations and of what the framework is. Excuse me, I'm a little nervous, but I just don't see how they could come and just decommission the neighborhood. It's a high vacancy, but there are still a lot of people there. But again, it started as a community garden, and it turned into a nonprofit community organization. And what we do is we have a computer lab in the library, and our goal is to revitalize our neighborhood. We've actually been in the process of purchasing homes to redevelop the neighborhood. One in particular is a house across the street from the community center that we need to expand our computer lab.
Thank you. I want to start by acknowledging the work that went into the document, and particularly the role of Dan Patera, who I'm sorry I missed his presentation at your last event. But if I were going to give you the history of the urban agricultural movement in Detroit, one of the key figures would be Dan Patera, who was part of the University of Detroit Mercy development of something called the Adama video, which was the first comprehensive vision of what urban farming could look like. And through the Boggs Center, I would guess we've shown that to meeting 2,000 to 3,000 people over the years, and it's really been a way to help invigorate this idea of urban agriculture. And so from that Adama video, I think that there's been a long history that Dan in particular has with urban agriculture and the idea of ecological development of the community. And I think that's reflected in the Detroit Works project. And I would say that the strengths of the Detroit Works project are things we ought to lift up. One is it's the first urban plan that really pushes this idea of a blue-green redevelopment for the city. The second thing is, it is the first one that actually comments on and builds on assets and strengths of the city. And it looks at the interconnections among the various elements: recreation, land use, transportation, infrastructure, and how these things all fit together rather than as separate areas of development. And in that sense, I think really reflects a sophisticated ecological sensitivity to the redevelopment of an urban area. And it's also the first plan that accepts the idea that we are probably not going to be back at 2 million anytime soon. In fact, we'll probably be headed the other direction yet again. And I think it's important to keep those strengths in mind, because the rest of what I'm going to say are things that I think are difficulties with the plan. And I want to say I've been involved since the very first meeting. I've attended a lot of the public meetings. I actually read the plan the whole way through, albeit a little sleepy here and there, but I did make it through. And I want to offer a perspective that I think is important for us to think about, because I think the whole process has opened up some serious questions for us. The central claims of the document are three. They say they want to establish a path toward realizing the aspirations of an entire city. They want to provide a guide for decision-making for all of us, and a process rooted in building trust and authentic engagement. And from my point of view and the people I talk with, they have failed on all three of these. And I think the primary reason they have failed is that the document lacks any sense of real history. The only history you get in the document is the population decline, but you don't get any collective understanding of why this decline has happened. We hear nothing about the role of corporations. We hear nothing about the change of technology. We hear nothing about the contentious relationship with policies from the state. And we hear nothing about the tensions within the region. That kind of ahistorical framing means that the document itself does not pose the question of a city in the midst of a transformation from an industrial era to a post-industrial era. And because it doesn't have that sense of history, there are three failings I want to point to tonight. The first of those failings in the document is there is no indictment of corporate power, nor is there any charge of corporate responsibility. And I think the clearest place to see this, which I've read in great detail, is the section on infrastructure. Like Rachel Maddow, I find infrastructure cute. So I read a lot of it. What you have in the infrastructure section is a long discussion of the need for recycling, which I think virtually everyone in the city knows would be a good idea. Even if you walk through this center, there's every effort made to tell you how to recycle everything inside the center, even though you know most of it's going to go right to the incinerator. Because anytime garbage goes out of this building, the only place it goes to the incinerator. So what we have in this document in infrastructure is both an argument for recycling and an argument for keeping the incinerator. And anybody who knows the history of either recycling or the incinerator knows that the reason we don't have recycling in Detroit is because the incinerator needs to burn our garbage in order to make the electricity to sell to the city and to DTE. In other words, these are mutually exclusive ideas. We cannot get recycling as long as we aren't the incinerator. Further, when you look at the incinerator, it is placed in the context of let's clean it up and also let's increase our carbon density so we have better air to breathe. The primary problem, other than cars in Detroit, is the incinerator, especially in terms of putting heavy metals in the air. So unless this document gives us a way to look at corporate power and to really examine some of the contradictions, it simply poses mutually exclusive alternatives without any way to choose. And that leads me to my second problem. There are no policy recommendations that protect the people who live here. And let me explain. They have all sorts of things like strategies and imperatives and calls to action, but there's actually no discussion of urban policy that might protect folks who actually live in the area. And an example of this, I think, is that in the document they actually support the development of Hans Farm, and in their nice maps you see that Hans is part of the carbon-dense forest area that they're proposing. Now, I don't know were any of you at the public meeting about Hans Farm? I think it would be fair to say that 99.9% of the people who were there, who lived primarily in the area of Hans Farm, opposed Hans Farm. Yet, here it is not only now in our city, but was actually placed in this document long before the public meeting. What that raises is where are the policies to protect and honor the people who actually live in a neighborhood when we come to choices about redevelopment. There aren't any that I could find. And so this leads me to my final concern, which is policies around what happens when some of this development starts and land prices go up. We all know that the number one thing that will happen is taxes will increase. And when taxes increase, people who live in the sort of low-density areas, as they call them, will see their taxes rise, and that is no doubt the way they'll be forced out. So people in your neighborhood, Mark, are going to experience higher taxes, they won't be able to pay them, and before long the house will go into foreclosure. We need policy suggestions that say overtly, we want to protect existing residents. And that would mean grandfathering in everybody who currently lives in low vacancy areas, so that if they choose to stay there, they are not driven out by higher taxes. Likewise, we need rent control. I don't know how many of you are living still around this area, but if you have lived here over the last 4 years, the number one thing you've noticed is that rents are going through the roof in Detroit in certain areas of the city. So we need policies that protect residents. This leads me to my final area of failure, which is that this was not really a process of engagement. This was a process of managed comment. And I've written rather extensively about this in the Michigan Citizen, but I think we in Detroit really need to think about what is happening to democracy in our city.
Right.
What's going on is that foundations are creating pseudo-democratic processes, which are ways that each of us as individuals can make our comments to somebody who supposedly is an authority, and then they will take our comment, write it down, put it up on some nice little board, and tell us that's citizens engagement. Citizens engagement means fighting over, do we want Hans Farm or not? Do we want the incinerator or not? It means arguing with each other over principles, over values, over specific policies, and over who the city is for. And that is not what happened to produce this plan. This so-called strategic framework are managed comments that are sanitized to avoid confrontation. And we need confrontation over ideas because it's serious what's happening in the city. And it's serious who benefits and who loses. So I implore you to take this plan and think about how to actually confront it, not just allow it to be managed. And the final thing I want to say about this, well, actually 2 things. I went to the website today to find out how many people had actually liked the plan. You know, they had over 200,000 managed engagements. Only 349 people as of 1 o'clock liked this thing. Now, I don't know about you, I get that many likes sometime when I make a comment. It is appalling. I would be embarrassed if those were all the likes I had. I hope somebody gets them out there and picks them up. But it speaks to the inability of the plan to actually touch what Detroiters are worried about. And I think that's because it lacked serious engagement over serious issues. If you want to engage with this plan, one of the community groups I work with is a writers group, and we have decided to launch our Detroit Future, break it down, the Justice and Equity Gap Analysis of the Detroit Works Project. And if you go to openingofdetroit.org, you can make your comments. And then we're going to bundle those up and take those to, if there's any power left that be, we'll take them there, but we'll certainly publish them and try to encourage conversation about it. So thank you.
If you need seats, there's some up here if you're looking for seats. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to take this in a little bit different direction. I was going to talk a little bit more about what we do in our community and how our community specifically is kind of related to this plan, and then talk then a little bit more about the plan in a broader sense. So if you're not familiar with Grandmont Rosedale, we are a cluster of 5 neighborhoods in northwest Detroit. Each of those 5 neighborhoods, which are North Rosedale Park, Grandmont, Grandmont 1, and Minnock Park, has their own neighborhood association that has a board elected by the residents. Those organizations organize block clubs throughout the neighborhood. Almost every block or groups of blocks have a designated block captain. Those neighborhoods are very well organized in terms of addressing issues that come before the community, organizing social events and things like that. Our organization serves as kind of a coalition of those 5 neighborhoods. So each of those neighborhoods is represented on our board of directors, and 100% of our board is made up of neighborhood residents. Our organization is a nonprofit community development corporation. We were started in 1989. I started working there in 1991. So I've been there almost since the beginning, but I was not one of the founders. And we do a broad range of activities that are geared toward preserving and strengthening those 5 neighborhoods. So we do things like purchase and renovation of vacant houses. We offer grants and loans to low-income homeowners to repair their homes. We do a lot of work around blight reduction, maintenance of vacant properties. We promote our neighborhood. We try to recruit people to come and move into our community. We do an annual neighborhood open house where we kind of highlight what the homes that we have and what we have to offer. We work on commercial revitalization. So we, particularly along Grand River, which is kind of our main street. We're located generally around Grand River and Southfield Freeway. We've done a lot of work with small business, matching grant, facade grant kind of things. We've done about 3 dozen of those to help not only strengthen the businesses in our neighborhood, but also to improve the way the district looks, make it more inviting, and hopefully attract more business and more customers. We've done a lot of work about public spaces and how to improve how parks are, how the streets, the sidewalks, that kind of thing. We assume a lot of responsibility that the city no longer assumes in a lot of ways. So we do the maintenance of parks and things that in a lot of places you'd expect city government to do. Over the years we've expanded. We've also done some commercial development where we've bought vacant commercial buildings, renovated them, brought new businesses into our neighborhood, and we're actually working on another project like that right now. We do a lot of other things too. I won't go on and on about it, but work on public safety, community organizing, beautification, tree planting. We operate a farmer's market and have for 7 years. We have a community garden. So a whole range of activities all geared around strengthening the neighborhood and really driven by the ideas and the desires of the people who live in those communities. About a year ago, we began a planning process of our own for our neighborhood that took place in parallel to the Detroit Future City plan, or at the same time anyway. So we did a very intensive kind of planning process where we did things like we did extensive surveying of residents, we did a lot of one-on-one meetings with neighborhood leaders, we had community forums. We had one large forum about a year ago that led to the creation of several task forces on various issues in the neighborhood, and people volunteers worked on those issues and brought ideas back to the back to the whole body. We had a steering committee that was made up of the presidents of all the associations, the president of GRDC, and representatives from each of those task forces. And the result was that we put that all together into what we call a quality of life plan for our community. And that plan was really finished about September, a couple months before this document was produced. I meant to bring a copy with me, but if you were interested, you actually can see a full copy of it on our website, which is at grandmontrosedale.com. So our process was different from the Future City in a lot of ways. We weren't looking at the whole city. We were only looking at our neighborhood. So we were also not looking 50 years down the road. We weren't looking at 10, 20, 50 years. We were looking at 3 to 5 years. We were looking really at, it wasn't really a land use plan, because in our community, we're not contemplating that land use per se is going to change dramatically in the next 3 to 5 years. It was much more of an action-oriented plan based on what could residents do in conjunction with GRDC and other nonprofits with a relatively small amount of resources, but all geared toward improving the quality of life in our community. At the same time, though, the results, one thing I did want to point out is that the results of the planning that we did in our neighborhood actually align pretty directly with the recommendations for our community that are in this plan. So we're what this plan calls a traditional neighborhood, and I think that's an accurate description of what our community is like. We're primarily single-family residential neighborhood. We have low number of vacant lots. We have a small number of houses that need to be demolished. We are dealing with vacancy as a result of foreclosures, and that's really a phenomenon primarily of the last 5 to 6 years. But we believe that our community can be sustained as a traditional neighborhood, and that does line up with the recommendations in this plan. We would like to see further development of our commercial districts, and in particular along Grand River. We believe that our community needs a commercial center, a commercial hub that could not only serve our immediate neighborhoods, but could serve a broader area of Northwest Detroit. That is also something consistent with this plan that views Grand River and Grand Mount Rosedale as a logical place for that kind of a neighborhood center. We would like to see a mass transit system, like a lot of people all over the city, and we would like to see Grand River as an important spoke in that bus rapid transit kind of system. That's also reflected in the plan. We would like to see more than just autos and mass transit, but a whole multi-faceted transportation plan that allows greater incorporation of non-motorized biking, walking, that kind of thing. That's also reflected in the plan. A strong idea that came out of our planning meetings was about seeing neighborhood schools as more than just a school, but more like a community center. and that those buildings that sit in the middle of our communities could be used in more ways, used after class time. That's the kind of theme that comes up frequently in our neighborhood. That's in the plan too. So I don't want to belabor the point except to say that for our community, a lot of what we see for our neighborhood is reflected in what this plan reflects for our neighborhood. Now, it's not necessarily true for every neighborhood. And in neighborhoods where they're dealing with a much higher level of vacancy, where the question of land use and where there's an open question of where the development path will lead, it could be a whole different experience than what we had. I would say that it's not just a coincidence that the plan reflects those things in our community, because I think on the one hand, our neighborhood was very organized in terms of having input into the planning process, attending a lot of the meetings. And also our plan as a community really grows out of an understanding, I think, of our situation on the ground, the trends that are happening in our community, the kind of market potential that's there. And I think the planners, there's a logic to it that is visible not just to residents, but also to planners. Sometimes that actually works out that way. In this case, so if people who've known me for a long time, I've often argued that we need a citywide plan, that we cannot just plan on a neighborhood level. I've heard a lot of people over the years say the city's plan should just be an amalgam of neighborhood plans, which I've never really accepted that, because of the points that you made as the strengths of this plan, that there are issues that need to be discussed and planned on a citywide level. Things like transportation systems need to be looked at citywide. And things like a city budget is a citywide document that has policy implications for all neighborhoods. And I wouldn't ever suggest that you just take the budget and divide it up equally by the blocks or something like that. There's got to be an overlaying policy. So in a lot of ways, I think there's some positive things about this document, and I think Shay did a good job of summarizing that. That idea that you need to look citywide, that there are issues that cut across communities, that there are ways in which we have to look at issues from multiple perspectives, because I think there's been my history of working with the city. The sort of business as usual is that the perspectives tend to be very short-term. They tend to be very siloed by department. Even within the city, departments don't talk to each other or coordinate their efforts. It seems to be very piecemeal. The whole Wayne County auction, how that's being handled, is a very piecemeal kind of process where instead of looking at how we can collectively coordinate and plan for our land, we're selling it off piece by piece in such a way that you can no longer even think about planning either citywide or neighborhood-wide. So I think there's some very important positive things about this plan. I do think that it's still at this point in the realm of ideas, essentially, and ideas need to be debated, and I think that it shouldn't be accepted as, it's not the Bible or the Quran or it's a series of ideas that are put out there now to be debated, to be discussed, and to look at. If we were to, for example, do planning in our community again, we would definitely take this plan and we would add that into the base of information that we used as we were examining the options, the factors, the data that we were considering. And I think that in some ways the plan would, and planning is a process that you don't just do it for 6 months, finish and you're done. It should be something that you revisit constantly. And so there are ideas in here that were not ideas that came forward in from our residents And particularly, I would say, ideas around things like blue and green infrastructure, which are not ideas that the general public has really had a lot of exposure to, really understands. But when we talk about those things in our community, we do find that those ideas are embraced. And so the plan does sort of challenge our neighborhood in some ways if we were to begin that process again. One of the other ways in which I think it challenges us a little bit is looking at, is kind of forcing us to look outside of our neighborhood boundaries. I think we tend to plan too much. We draw our lines, say, here's our neighborhood, what's our plan for our neighborhood? And there's certain things in here, for example, that the idea of a job district on McNichols Road between Southfield and Livernois, essentially. And that's not, that doesn't come up in our planning because that's outside of our boundaries. But obviously, if such a thing were to develop, it would have implications for our community that we shouldn't ignore, that we should think about how do we relate. So having that citywide plan kind of pushes us to think beyond the boundaries of our own community. I will finish by saying I think that if you read through the plan, there are a lot of very general statements that it's hard to disagree with. But the real issue is how do they get put into action? And how do they get interpreted when the point comes to act? And I think that's where the whole idea of an ongoing dialogue and debate and broader discussion of the ideas in here is what is very important, because I see this more as a starting point, kind of something that's pushing us to look in certain ways that we haven't looked before, but certainly not, the last word.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative for a second. I threw another question at Mark that I wanted him to speak to. He opened up by talking a bit about decommissioning certain parts of the city versus repurposing. And so it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit more, Mark, about kind of the distinctions between the two in particular, and even tell us a little bit more about the Georgia Street neighborhood itself in that context.
Well, the Georgia Street neighborhood is actually known in the city as the airport neighborhood, city airport neighborhood. It's south of City Airport off of Gratiot and Harper. Our boundaries are Van Dyke, Gratiot, Harper, and Grinnell. The decommissioning part, to me, decommissioning of our neighborhood has been going on technically since like 1970s when Coleman A. Young had decided that he wanted to try to expand City Airport. A lot of people don't know that in the 70s and the 80s, they started having community meetings, almost like how they were trying to do this. I remember sitting with my dad at some of our neighborhood community meetings with the city. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of people started moving out of our neighborhood, was because they thought the airport was coming through. They were given a lot of promises of the neighborhood, of the city coming through and buying up the properties. Also, in the 90s, a lot of the vacant lots in our neighborhood, because we've always had a problem with vacant lots ever since I was a kid. I remember playing football and things, in different vacant lots. But the vacant lots were owned by individuals, and they had to me, looked like a whole lot of fake names. And then all of a sudden, the late 90s, early 2000s, all of a sudden, I don't know if you know the process of all the vacant lot when it goes, or a property when it goes into foreclosure, it goes into foreclosure through Wayne County, and then Wayne County gives it back to the city. All of a sudden, in the early 2000s, these vacant properties became property of the city again. I don't know if it was because of the start of the decommissioning process back when Dennis Archer was mayor or what, but it just kind of looks fishy. So my idea of repurpose on our neighborhood is in urban agriculture. Like I said, we started off as a community garden. We're now an urban farm, which I do like that better. But I see our neighborhood, and a lot of people in our neighborhood see our neighborhood as being able to go into urban agriculture, not just for not just for making money or economics, but as far as teaching people where our food come from, and knowing where our food come from.
So there was a lot that each speaker raised, and we should open it up now to the floor. And I guess what we'd ask, considering there's a number of people here, is try and keep your questions and or comments to 2 minutes or less, so that we can get as many people as possible. And I really want some of my students to also think about contributing. Don't feel intimidated. These are all complicated things that we all are trying to learn about. So I hope everybody will feel welcome. So I'll do my best to take an order and follow it as well as I can. Feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to do the Oprah thing and throw the phone at you, throw this at you. Who wants to start? I have some questions in my back pocket if somebody doesn't want to start.
I'll start.
Thank you. Maybe tell us who you are, too.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Davita Davison, and really quickly, I'm back to Detroit, which is my hometown. I was born and raised here. I lived in New York for almost 20 years, and I have to say real quickly that I'm back here not by choice. Hurricane Sandy destroyed my home, destroyed my business. I lost everything, and I came back to the city of Detroit, which is my hometown. And to take that a step further, I had no intentions of staying here. I was going to take my insurance money, sleep on my parents' couch for about a month or so, and go back to New York. But I didn't do that, and I'm not going to do that. And I hate to drink the Kool-Aid, but there is a commercial that was produced, I think, by Kid Rock or Dan Gilbert, and it says, "What does opportunity look like?" Opportunity to me looks like Detroit, seriously. So my question really is to the panel, and that is I moved to New York in the early 90s. So I had the opportunity to have a front row seat of what we call gentrification. You couldn't pay me to move to Harlem or to Williamsburg in Brooklyn or to Bedford-Stuyvesant. Fast forward 15, 20 years, I couldn't move in those neighborhoods now if I wanted to. They're so expensive. So my question is, as we begin to see these neighborhoods in Detroit change, specifically the blue-green spaces that you talked about, is there another urban city that's doing this type of urban agriculture that Detroit is doing, or is Detroit kind of ground zero for urban agriculture? And if it is, how do we protect our citizens from not going back into what my great-grandparents were, and that's mere sharecroppers? How do we protect the citizens of Detroit with this urban agriculture that's sprouting up, so they're just not working for someone else?
Great questions.
No offense, but I think that's nonsense. We're not going back to sharecropping. Even with Hans Farms, the idea of making a lot of money farming, I think is not realistic. So, I mean, I don't think we have to worry about that. I don't think Detroit is going that far backwards, or I don't like to say backwards, but I think as far as, because we have so much open space that it allows us to be able to grow a lot of food. Personally, we have what I call, what we call an urban farm. We grow a lot of food, but our food is free to the neighbors. It's a way to subsidize what they have to go to the grocery store and get during the growing season. A lot of it when we're trying to do extensions, to grow more. But it's not necessarily, I've been asked that so many times about, going back to slavery and sharecropping, and I don't see how we can even think about going to that point. Because, a lot of people could own their own plots, own their own land and grow their own food. So I don't understand that.
I have a cough drop. You have to forgive me. I've got one of these colds right now. I think there's a lot in your question to think about. Right now, 10% of the city identifies as white on the census. So that's not a lot, but I think some areas of the city are whiter than others. And I think those areas tend to be the areas that get most of the resources. So I think we have to find a way as a city to talk productively about race, because under gentrification is this whole race dynamic. And I mean, I read the Belle Isle vision, right? They want a whiter, wealthier city, where most of the city is designed to serve the whiter, wealthier part. And I think we are at a moment where we have the opportunity to intervene in that. The Black Food Security Network has begun, maybe 3 years ago now, conversations on race in the food system. I think the essence of the food system, as Mark is saying, is to produce what we need for ourselves in the city. And that control of production is really a critical aspect of maintaining what people call food sovereignty. And I think that's something that we need to support, and that's what I find not in the Detroit Works project. They don't give us any idea how we might support that. The other thing I would say is that Detroit is an African American city. There's a sensibility here that comes from the history of African Americans, and I think all of us, regardless of our ethnicity, have a responsibility to say, how do we protect that? Because we know that just last census, Washington, D.C., which used to be a predominantly African American city, lost that status. So what gets lost in that kind of transition is something we need to really pay attention to. So I think in your question is for us to really probe who's the city for, what's the development for, whose values and whose culture are placed in the center. And I think those are questions that deserve public discussion.
I just want to touch a little bit on the issue of gentrification, because I actually think that in the city of Detroit, there are very few neighborhoods that are really at any threat of gentrification. And, you know, the Midtown area is an area that we are seeing rising rents and people are being moved out. And I think that's an area that we should be planning for permanent affordable housing as part of a mix of housing ranges. Whether we could get rent control, I don't know, but at least we could get some forms of permanent affordable housing built into every area that is redeveloping. I think in cities like Washington, D.C., where the economy is driven by an enormous lobbying industry, you know, there's pools of money in New York City and in D.C. that don't exist here in Detroit, in Wall Street in New York, that change the dynamic of how those cities developed. I think we're actually in more danger of property values dropping further than shooting through the roof, because I mean, there was a thing in the Detroit News today that 50% of all property in the city, residential, commercial, is delinquent on their taxes. It's a reflection of property abandonment. And so I'm not as concerned about that issue of taxes rising. I think there are areas where that should be a concern and should be built into any plan that's put forward for those areas.